any more than anyone else does. And so one of the things that I said on the floor, on one of my many floor speeches on Scott Pruitt, was specifically to EPA employees, is to say, because I figured they were the only ones watching at 2:30 a.m. and you guys, because not 2:30 a.m., was that they have obligations under the law and they have rights under the law. And so, you know, even though I'm a Democrat, that doesn't mean I'm not that I'm never frustrated with a bureaucracy. But now I'm thinking, thank God for the bureaucracy. Yeah. Thank God for the civil servants and the career public servants who understand that their job is not to implement any president's agenda, right, but rather to obey the law. And if they're in Region 9 of an agency, then they've got laws and rules, and they gotta do those things. So part of what has happened, I think, in the first month was Bannon in particular wants to provoke and terrify. And so some of these things are announcing things that they're going to take 3 or 4 years to accomplish, and it's not even clear that they can. So I have Andy Weiner, my chief of staff here. He used to be at NOAA under President Obama, and he knows to undo a rule is actually it's not just as hard as making a new rule, it's harder. Because what you have to do is you have to go through the whole rulemaking process, and then you have to reverse all the findings. And then a judge has to determine that you weren't arbitrary in reversing all the findings. In other words, you cannot just say there's a new president, we want a new rule. So all of that rulemaking, not so easy to reverse. All of that lawmaking, illegal to reverse. And so one of the things that I want us to remember is that we are still this grand experiment in self-governance, right? We're still in charge of our government. This person occupies the seat of the presidency, but we're still in charge of our government, and it still has to be lawful. And so, but I think you're right that sort of staying confident, staying happy as a person, it can be a little bit of a challenge during this time. I would just remind you that this may take a while, right? And so whatever you need to do to stay in this and not run out of steam, that's good for the team too. I'm gonna do I'm gonna do 5 more questions, and I'm gonna give you very quick answers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do 4. 5.
I have concerns about the mental health of our president. And is there an agency, or is there someone that oversees that? Is it his own doctor? Or honestly, I really am very concerned.
Well, I'm concerned about the actions of the president. I'm not going to diagnose him, and I think it's very, it's a delicate conversation to have, not just because, just for the obvious reasons, but also mentally ill adults are not dangerous, right? And so when we characterize him as crazy, I think it does a disservice to people with severe and persistent mental illness who are actually not a danger to the republic. And so I observe things in him that I think are dangerous to the country and to potentially civilization. I am not going to get into the business of diagnosing whether it is merely a political view, a leadership style, or something more inside of him. But I just personally feel very uncomfortable with the characterization of him as someone who is mentally ill and therefore should be removed from office, because lots of people suffer from mental illness and do lots of really important things and should not be removed on the basis of of whatever needs they may have. I recognize, however, that this is behavior,
right,
which, however you want to label it, clinically or politically, is just dangerous. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to bring the conversation back to Steve Bannon and really encourage you to keep him off the National Security Council. My husband is active duty Marine Corps. I need to know that when he deploys into harm's way, that he's doing so for national security reasons and not to energize the Republican base. My kids need to know when Daddy's gone that he's gone for the right reasons and not just to satisfy some politicians' whims. What will you do? beyond writing the bill, what will you do to get bipartisan support, to bring other people in, to see that this is a national issue?
First of all, thank you for being a military family. Congratulations on your little one. I can't tell if it's a boy or a girl from here. But really thank you, and I know it's extremely difficult, and we owe it to you and your baby and your husband to make sure that if and when anybody's put into harm's way, that it's in America's best interest. I'm not confident that that's the case with Steve Bannon on the national security team. I am preliminarily satisfied with the new national security advisor nominee. I don't know a lot about him, and I haven't been briefed on him, but from what I've read, the criterion is not would I prefer this person, but rather are they sane and competent and lawful. This person appears to meet that test. I'm just going to be blunt, because I think part of what we have to do when we engage in a dialogue is that I have to tell you what we can do and what we can't do and what there still is to do and all the rest of it. I'm not sure, because I've been going back and forth with my staff, what sort of mechanisms there are to get Bannon away from the NSC. There is a belief among, and I've asked for third opinions on this, among the lawyers, that this is within the constitutional prerogatives of the president. So there is a category of thing, as objectionable as it is, called we lost the election, and this is a direct consequence of Donald Trump being president of the United States. So I think one thing we can do is continue to apply political pressure, but there may not be things that I can do in the lawmaking context that would change that, because you're talking about a constitutional provision. So
what can you do in terms of applying political pressure?
Well, I think we can continue to raise the issue of the composition of the NSC. And that is how we're trying to get bipartisan support. To ask a Republican to get on board with legislation that, specifically attacks Bannon is a non-starter. But talking about the fact that the Director of National Intelligence and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were removed from the NSC is, first of all, just as objectionable and without any justification, except that it was written by Bannon. I mean, that executive order was written by Bannon, but it also it gives us an ability to talk about this issue. Yes, you.
Okay, so my thing was about the Supreme Courts, because I feel like, as you mentioned, the Supreme, there would need to be justices that would have to sway in order for repealing of different acts. And the thing is that right now the Supreme Court is kind of 50-50, and if there was to add Gorsuch, there would be more conservatives than there would be. And then with the fact that a whole bunch of the liberal Supreme Court justices might resign or might pass within the next 4 years, there's a really big possibility that there would be this problem. And what I was reading was about the fact that the Democrats already went nuclear on the filibuster, on the previous filibuster with the cabinets, and then so the problem being that what is your stance about Republicans now maybe going nuclear on the Supreme Court filibuster, and what would you guys be able to do if that was the case, or how are you guys going to fight?
So thank you for the question. It's maybe the most important question right now. On the question of whether or not the rules are changed, that is entirely in Mitch McConnell's hands. And I do not think he wants to do it, but I think he is going to go through with it if we oppose Gorsuch. Well, let me tell you my concern about Gorsuch. There is among lawyers, and I'm not one, among lawyers there is a kind of collegiality where they talk about him in the same way they talked about John Roberts, actually. He writes so clearly, he thinks so well, and then you go to, the resume, which of course is perfect, right? I mean, these guys, they come out of the Federalist Society, they are handpicked for being impeccable, right? And for being almost indecipherable in terms of having a right-wing agenda. And so it shouldn't surprise you that this person is coming out of the sort of John Roberts school. He's going to be charming, he's going to say very little, but in very, very clear-minded ways.
Sorry, we're going to let the paramedics.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
all back
How about
come
if I
this
go
way.
out the door?
Well,
I don't wanna
let's-
disturb
let's
you, this is really important.
Yeah.
That's the
So-
right there.
And so,
Why don't we keep going
Yeah,
so she doesn't feel
she's on, okay.
self-conscious?
So I worry because I think people worry, in fact, think too much about the personal temperament of the nominee, which I'm sure is impeccable, about the intellectual qualifications, which I'm sure is impeccable. I mean, right? He doesn't get to be nominated coming through that process without very likely being a star in the conservative universe. But I think the way we should look at this is that, you know, just like John Roberts, on the stuff that structurally changed America, on the Voting Rights Act, right? On giving corporations constitutional rights, under Hobby Lobby, or Citizens United, on the stuff that really structurally changes America to advantage especially corporations and to disadvantage especially people, especially vulnerable people. I have a feeling that this individual is going to be right down the line. And so that's my concern. I always say that I will meet with a nominee before coming to a conclusion, but I would just say that his record is, his temperament, his resume is sort of beyond reproach as near as I can tell. Now, maybe something will come up that'll show me something different, but his judicial record is actually well to the right of center, and specifically on Hobby Lobby, he was one of the opinions that sort of laid the groundwork for conferring on a corporation a constitutional right to the exercise of their religion. Okay, so remember that under Citizens United, they have a constitutional right to speech, which is under Buckley considered money. Now that was radical enough, but there's now a new right being given to companies that they get to have religious rights. Corporations get to have religious rights. I find that to be a pretty radical and new doctrine, and it's really hard for me to understand how how a corporation has any right to the free exercise of the corporation's religion, especially at the expense of the individuals who work for the corporations. There were two last questions, and I'm definitely getting the hook. Yes.
I'm concerned about the illegal immigrants that reside in our communities, and do we have to fear that our friends, our neighbors, the people who help us, you know, stay together as a community? And I think we feel very removed, you know, here in Hawaii. But as soon as I saw what was going on in other parts of the country, I thought, does anybody know? Is ICE rounding up people here? And do we have a fear? Should we be concerned about this? And can we become a sanctuary state? I mean,
So
20,000 questionable immigrants here in
So it's
Hawaii.
really difficult to know what is happening in the Department of Homeland Security and with ICE at this point. Today's announcement was not clarifying, it was more confusion. And so, and remember that a lot of the things that ICE and DHS were doing under President Obama were pretty objectionable in the context of people who are in this country without documentation. And so I am trying to gather as much information as I can. I'm actually wary in this specific instance of being misled intentionally by the White House. So I'm trying to figure out what the fact pattern is before we go ahead and act. The last point I'll make on this is that if they try to designate 1 million or so people as sort of eligible for deportation, the statute authorizes them to do that. They have nowhere near the money to arrest, detain, deport. And I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee, and I just announced today, I will not fund that. This will cost in the billions of dollars. But I have to just be, totally blunt about, we don't know exactly what's going on here, because I think there is a little bit of a tug and a pull between Secretary Kelly and the White House. And so I'm hoping that the Secretary wins. in implementation. So I think it's too early to tell exactly how draconian it's going to be. I think it's very reasonable to assume, to hope for the best but plan for the worst. There was one last question, or was there not?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So just a little bit different tangent here is as an individual citizen, I know how to survive this, but collectively, it feels like we're becoming codependent nation. And soon to become like dysfunctional family or dysfunctional nation. That's how it's feeling. So as collectively, as citizens in civic engagement, do you have any thoughts on what should our strategy be that could be working with DNC?
So can I just say that I think that and this is not a cop-out because I don't know how many of you know me from before, I love political strategy. I love sitting down and saying, okay, let's map this thing out. I think that is not what should happen. I think that the strategy has to come from the ground up. I think the coolest thing that has happened has been the Women's March, and has been Indivisible, and has been all of these people who have engaged with their politicians. I'll be the tip of the spear legislatively. I'll fight the fight. We'll coordinate our efforts. I'll try to be as direct and honest and frequent in my communication as I possibly can be. But I am no longer a believer that I have any particular strategic wisdom about what needs to happen, except to say this, trust in each other, right? There's an old saying that a movement is trust in strangers, right? A movement is trust in strangers, and this movement is growing because you all trust each other. You may no longer be strangers, but part of it is understanding that, we've been given a republic if we can keep it. And that's what you're all up to. So thank you very much.
To 50 minutes of that week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we represent some 1,200 folks from multiple different groups, and they will all hear from us about your comments today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you be speaking publicly somewhere else that we can?
Not this week, but I'll do it on the next trip back.
Will you do a picture with us?
Yeah, but
We'll do it fast. Come on, gang. Get around. Everybody that can, put the baby up front.
Baby up front.
Oh, God.